Hi, my name's Nikolai, aka 56Miner, and today we're unboxing our March Premium box. This month's box is all about creating our own custom watercolors. We'll go over the materials, talk a bit about color theory, and I'll share some tips and tricks that I picked up while working with everything. We've got a lot to cover this month, so let's get into it. For our surface this month, we have the Canson Montfall watercolor block. Now we call this pad a block because it has gum sides along the edges. This helps keep the paper from warping, but we still have an exposed edge so we can lift those pages off. The next three items in our box are going to be a set of SketchBox signature pigment powders, and they're going to act as the base of our watercolor. Because they're a primary set, we'll be able to mix our secondary and tertiary colors with a little bit of help from our 6-well palette from Art Alternatives. Our next item is going to be a bottle of SketchBox signature gum arabic, and gum arabic is going to be pivotal for our watercolors. Now that we've got all of our materials, let's mix our watercolor. For this stage of the process, I definitely suggest laying down a piece of paper. That way you don't unintentionally stain the surface that you're working on with those pigment powders. I'm going to mix about equal parts of the gum arabic and the pigment powder. This will allow for a very opaque watercolor, but we can create a more transparent watercolor by increasing the amount of gum arabic that we use. You definitely want to use a slow and steady hand when mixing our gum arabic and our pigment powder together. Because that pigment powder is super pigmented and you don't want to get it everywhere, but also because you want to make sure that you break down those granules into the gum arabic as much as possible. This will allow for a much smoother watercolor. Now you can definitely combine these three pigments in different ratios to create a variety of hues, but I'm going to focus on the primaries. That way if I find a color I really love, I can always go back and mix up a custom watercolor. Now as the water starts to evaporate from that gum arabic, these watercolors will harden. Here, I've gone ahead and mixed up some watercolor in a bottle cap, and you can see that it acts just like a typical watercolor half pan. It's solid to the touch and doesn't rub off on your fingers. Let's grab the next item in this month's box, the SketchBox Signature Angled Chisel Brush, and explore some of those hues available to us. By just mixing two of our three primaries, we can get a variety of hues. I'm partial to the red-violet from our blue and our reds, but we can also get a variety of really nice greens with these colors. These are going to be known as our secondary colors, but we can also create tertiary colors by mixing all three. Taking just a little bit of our red watercolor and diluting it, we can create a nice subtle pink, and depending on how you hold your brush, you can achieve a variety of marks. Now, angled chisels are great for filling in wide areas and achieving more structured lines, but we can also use the tip to make more organic shapes. By mixing just a little bit of our blue, we can shift that pink more to a purple, and I'm going to use it just to sketch in some grapes. Now, due to the nature of our pigment powder, that dye is going to want to spread out through all of the wet area. So we're not going to get much grain, and we'll typically get a lot of flat color with these. Now, when it comes to mixing colors, there's a couple things to keep in mind that can make things a bit easier for you. By its nature, yellow is going to be our lightest value color, so it's going to be easily overpowered by our blue. So when it comes to mixing shades like greens or subtle yellows, you're going to want to make sure that you use a lot of that yellow pigment and just a dab of the blue. Now the more water that you have mixed in with your watercolor, the lighter and thinner that color is going to be. So if you want really dark, rich tones, you'll want to use less water and more pigment. We can also layer our colors to achieve a darker value, but it's important that you let that first layer fully dry before going back in, or your watercolors can bleed together. Using a bit of paper towel, I'll clean out one of my wells, and let's use it to explore our yellows and our reds. Starting with pure yellow, I'll start to add a little bit of red to our watercolor. That way we can shift it from a yellow to an orange to a peach, and then finally to that strong crimson red. By working fairly quickly while that surface is still wet, we can minimize streaking and let those pigments pull and bleed into each other. Now if you're looking for a more subtle gradient this month, you can blend those lines between the colors a little bit more. Here I'm more exploring how that pigment pulls and works on its own. By using more water in our color mixing, we can achieve a more pastel effect. As you explore the colors available to us this month, remember you can always go back and mix your own custom watercolor that's unique to you. And because watercolor is a transparent medium, We can always go back in and change and shift our colors by just going over them again. However, if you want to create any distinct shapes, it's really important that you let that layer dry fully before going back in. Doing some simple warm-ups like this is a great way to familiarize yourself with the materials, and it's kind of a low-stakes way in order to just get your creative juices flowing. Let's grab the next item in this month's box, the Copic Multi-Liner in brown. Fine liners are great because they offer us thin and consistent marks, and because this is a 0.1 nib, we get these smooth, subtle lines. Now that we've got a good understanding of our materials, I'm going to do something a little bit more complex and create a water lily illustration. You're welcome to follow along with me or take some inspiration from our prompt, Drip. I'm going to start by drawing a few lily pads, and we're going to simplify those down to circles with a little pie wedge coming out. Next, I'll move on to a few water lilies, making sure to use a very light hand with our fine liner. Because it's a 0.1mm nib, it can bend on us, so make sure not to apply too much pressure. I also want to ensure that I'm leaving enough open space between my lily pads, that way I can still depict the water. And it's worth noting that I am looking at photo reference of lily pads while I do this, because it's always important to reference life when drawing. Now that we've got some line art established, we can go in with our watercolor. I always like to have a spare sheet of paper when I work with watercolor, that way I can kind of check my colors before committing them to my page. And because our Copic fine liner is waterproof, we don't have to worry about any of our lines bleeding. In order to increase the color variance in my lily pads, I'm going to take our two greens from earlier and mix them as I fill in those areas. This will allow the pigment to bleed and offer us a lot of color variance. This is definitely just personal preference. I like color variance as I think it adds a little bit more life and realism to a piece, but you can still create a beautiful illustration using flat color. Mixing our two colors, I'll create a third color and I'll use that on the greens of my water lilies. Now, a common problem with color mixing is you can mix two really great colors, but they really don't work well together. So to avoid this, I'm going to take the darkest green I have and mix in more of our blue. That way we still have that little bit of yellow in it to harmonize everything. Taking advantage of the wide side of our chisel brush, I'll go in and start to fill in areas, using the tip to help differentiate between the lily pads. So I'm going to use this blue that we mixed, not only as the base color of the water, but also to add some shadows to our lily pads to imply depth. Now, I want some variance in my water. I want certain areas to be darker and certain areas to be lighter. So I'm kind of jumping around and giving that watercolor an opportunity to dry a bit before going back in. Now, if you don't let your first layer dry completely, you can run into a bit of color bleed, like we're going to see in the bottom left of my piece. And this happens because our pigments want to spread out to any wet area. Now, to combat it and correct this, we can dry our brush a little bit on the surface and then pick up that pigment. While it's not going to fix it completely, it will help to stop the bleed. Let's grab the final item in this month's box, a pot of the Pearl X Antique Silver Pigment Powder. We can use this to add a bit of sparkle to our watercolors. Taking some of our gum arabic, I'll mix up a small amount of silver watercolor. And I'm doing this because that gum arabic is the binder that helps the pigment stick to our paper. If we don't do this, we run the risk of that pigment just flaking off after it dries. The silver is also going to neutralize some of the colors in our blue, so it's going to come out a little bit more desaturated. I'm going to use this color to add a few ripple lines to our water, that way we get a bit of a shimmer and a bit more life. As our metallic watercolor starts to dry, those sparkles are going to pull to the edges of those lines and give us a really fun effect. Making sure I have a fairly wet brush, I'm going to go in with some of the pure silver and just add it to areas of white around the piece to add some visual interest. Now for our lilies, I'm going to bring back that subtle pink color that we talked about earlier and use it as a base layer to color that area. Once I've got that good first layer down, I'll take some more of our red pigment and dab it in the center, taking advantage of our blooming technique in order to create a really soft and beautiful gradient. Once my paper is fully dry, I'll take a butter knife and use it to remove the paper from the watercolor block. Starting from the exposed edge that we talked about early in the video, I'll work my way around slowly with a butter knife and remove the paper from the block. As a final step, I'll go back in with our Copic multi-liner, emphasizing a few lines where the lily pads meet, and adding a few details and dots just to give everything a little bit more believability. I'll add some lines around the circumference of our lily pads to imply some depth, and a few dots just to break it up a bit. If you're taking inspiration from our prompt drip this month, definitely incorporate that metallic watercolor because it gives us a really fun effect when depicting liquids. And with that, our piece is complete. Hope you enjoyed it, learned a few things, and if you post your work online, make sure you use hashtag SketchBoxMarch. We love seeing what y'all create each month. And if you want to check out any of our previous videos, head over to YouTube where you can like and subscribe. And I'll see you next month.